Hey there, fellow knowledge seeker. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to tackle some seriously big questions with, well, a pretty big thinker.
You're talking about Immanuel Kant, right?
Yep, that's the one. We're going deep into his philosophy of religion. But don't worry, I'm not expecting you to become a Kantian scholar overnight.
We'll try to make it as painless as possible, and hopefully even a little fun.
That's the goal. So, to guide us on this journey, we've got excerpts from two of Kant's works. First up, we have Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason.
And to add another layer, we'll also be drawing from his essay, What Does It Mean to Orient Oneself in Thinking?
So we've got like two lenses to view this complex stuff, right?
Precisely. And they both offer some really unique perspectives on how Kant approached, well, how we approach these massive questions of faith, reason, and morality. Now, our mission today, should we choose to accept it,
Is to make these intricate ideas, understandable, maybe even relatable. Like, how can we apply this stuff to our own lives?
Exactly. It's about bridging the gap between, 18th century philosophy and 21st century living.
Yeah, because honestly, when I hear Immanuel Kant, I kind of picture like a dusty old book on a shelf somewhere.
And a very serious portrait of a guy with a powdered wig.
Right. But he was grappling with questions that are still relevant today. Like, how do we balance freedom of thought with, well, not letting our minds just run wild?
That's a great point. Kant was a big believer in freedom of thought, but he also warned against what he called the lawless use of reason. It's like, you can't just believe anything you want, right? There needs to be some kind of, some structure.
Some guidelines.
Yeah.
Like a framework for thinking.
That's it. And that's where his idea of orienting oneself in thinking comes in. He actually uses this analogy of geography. Like, imagine you're in unfamiliar territory.
Okay, I'm picturing myself lost in the woods somewhere.
Right. So you need a compass, you need landmarks to figure out where you are and where you're going. And Kant says it's the same with thinking, especially when you're dealing with abstract ideas, like faith or the divine.
Oh, okay, so it's about finding your bearings, your intellectual compass points, so to speak.
Exactly. It's about understanding how your beliefs fit into a larger framework, like a system of understanding. And that brings us to one of Kant's most fundamental ideas, his critical philosophy. This is where he makes that crucial distinction between, phenomena.
Phenomena, you mean like the things that we experience with our senses, the world we can see and hear and touch?
That's it. But then he contrasts that with noumena.
Noumena. Okay, now you've lost me. What are noumena?
Think of it this way. Phenomena are like the shadows on a cave wall, but noumena are the actual objects casting those shadows. It's the underlying reality, the stuff we can't directly access with our senses.
Okay, so it's like the difference between, I don't know, seeing a tree and understanding the biological processes that make a tree a tree.
You got it. And Kant argues that, we can really only truly know phenomena, not noumena. We're limited by our human perception.
Okay, that's a mind bender for sure. But how does this all connect to religion? If we can't directly know this ultimate reality behind everything, what does that mean for our faith?
That's where things get really interesting. So, because of this distinction, Kant says we can't use pure reason to prove or disprove God's existence.
Whoa, hold on. He's saying we can't prove that God exists or doesn't exist.
Right. It's just beyond the grasp of our theoretical knowledge. It's like trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon.
Okay, so if we can't prove anything definitively, where do we even start with religion?
For Kant, it's not about proof, but about understanding the role of faith, within the boundaries of reason.
So it's not about throwing reason out the window. It's more about figuring out how faith and reason can kind of work together.
Exactly. He argues that while theoretical reason can't access that noumenal realm, there's this thing called practical reason, which guides our actions. And it needs certain beliefs to function.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What kind of beliefs are we talking about here?
Well, let's consider this age-old question. If God is all good and all-powerful, why is there so much suffering in the world?
Oh, man, the problem of evil. That's a heavy one.
It is. And it really bothered Kant. He challenged all those traditional theodicies, those attempts to explain why a good God would allow bad things to happen.
Like the idea that suffering is a test of faith or part of some grand cosmic plan?
Yeah, all those classic explanations. But Kant was like, nope, not buying it. He even goes so far as to identify 3 specific sources of moral evil. He calls them holiness, goodness, and justice.
Hold up. Evil coming from holiness and goodness. Can you unpack that for me?
Sure. So by holiness, he's talking about the existence of moral evil in the world, period. Goodness represents the suffering of rational beings. And justice highlights that, well, often disproportionate punishment. We see, good people suffering while bad people seem to get away with everything. He's saying that even if the world was created by a good God, there are these inherent tensions and contradictions that we have to, grapple with.
Okay, so he's acknowledging the reality of evil. But then what? It's not like he can just say, well, it's a mystery, let's move on.
Right. He doesn't do that. He points to this, well, pretty radical idea.
Hit me with it.
He says the root of evil doesn't lie in some, external force, but within us.
Wait, so he's saying we're not corrupted by some outside evil, but by our own choices. That's intense. But if evil comes from within, does that mean we're all doomed to be bad?
Not necessarily. And this leads us to another key concept: rational faith.
Okay, not blind faith, but faith based on reason. I'm not sure I'm following you.
You're on the right track. Think of it as a belief that's grounded in the needs of reason, not on, empirical evidence. It's about figuring out what we must believe for morality to even make sense.
Okay, so we can't prove these things, but we need to believe them for morality to have any real weight. What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, he argues that morality needs us to believe in certain things, like the existence of God and immortality, to make moral progress meaningful. Think about it: if there's no ultimate justice, no possibility of achieving the highest good, then what's the point of being virtuous? Why even bother?
Yeah. Without that belief in something beyond, our moral efforts would be pointless, like building a house on sand.
Exactly. And that foundation, for Kant, is this idea of rational faith. It's not about blindly accepting dogma, but recognizing that our need for a moral universe kind of points towards certain beliefs.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this all play out in the real world? Does Kant think we can actually create a perfect moral society? Come on, you've met humans, right?
Good point. He introduces this concept of an ethical community, a society based not just on laws, but on virtue, on the moral law. He compares it to the kingdom of God, an ideal state where the good principle prevails.
Okay, so I'm picturing some utopian society where everyone is just, perfectly moral all the time. It sounds a bit far-fetched.
Yeah, and Kant knew that. He's pretty skeptical about achieving this perfect ethical state, given human nature and all. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. He sees this struggle between, the ideal and reality playing out throughout history.
So it's like an ongoing process, a constant back and forth between our better and, well, less than better selves. But where does organized religion fit into all of this?
That's where we get into some of his, well, let's call them nuanced views on scripture and the role of the church. It might surprise you, but organized religion does have a place in his philosophy.
Wait, really? I thought he was all about pure reason. So he's not anti-religion.
Not exactly. He's not talking about blind faith or literal interpretations. He sees scripture as having a moral use, not a factual one. And the church, well, he thinks it's important for promoting this pure faith of reason and encouraging moral improvement, both for individuals and for society.
So he's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. He's saying religion, when understood correctly, can be a force for good.
You got it. But he's also got some strong words for what he calls priestcraft, basically, using religious authority for power and control.
So no blind obedience to dogma or just going through the motions of rituals?
Right. He's emphasizing a virtuous disposition, actually living in accordance with the moral law over empty rituals or just blindly accepting what you're told.
So for Kant, it's not about what you say you believe, but how you actually live. Actions speak louder than words.
That's the heart of it. And this leads to a pretty big question that he raises. What happens at the end of all things?
Okay, now we're getting existential.
Yeah.
Is he talking about, the end of the world, Judgment Day?
He definitely goes there. He explores the concept of eternity, what it means for humanity. He even talks about time ceasing to exist and how our human minds can't really grasp this ultimate end.
Okay, I can already feel my brain reaching its limits. That's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. But here's what's so compelling. In the face of all this uncertainty, Kant doesn't advocate for despair.
So he's not all doom and gloom.
Nope. Instead, he points to he calls it a heroic faith in virtue, even when we don't know the outcome. It's about acting morally, even if we don't have all the answers.
So even if we don't know what happens after we die, we should still strive to live a good life, a life guided by those moral principles.
That's it in a nutshell. And that brings us back to that analogy of finding our way in thinking, like we talked about before.
Right. That idea of using a compass and landmarks to figure out where we are, even in unfamiliar territory.
He's saying we need to find our own compass points, our own guiding principles when we're venturing into these really big questions.
I love that analogy. But, okay, how do we actually do that? How do we cultivate this heroic faith and navigate all the complexities of life when there's no instruction manual?
Well, that's a question we'll explore in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll dig into Kant's ideas about moral development, the nature of good and evil, and how we can, strive to live a life that's both meaningful and virtuous.
Okay, I'm ready for round 2. But before we jump into that, can we just take a moment to recap what we've learned so far? My brain's a little overloaded.
Absolutely. It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
So, what's standing out to you from what we've discussed? What are you taking away from this first part of our Kantian adventure?
Honestly, I think what's hitting me the hardest is Kant's insistence that we need a moral framework. A belief in something beyond just ourselves, to give our actions meaning. Like, we can't just rely on laws or rewards and punishments. We need to anchor our morality in something bigger.
That's a great observation. And it's that yearning for meaning, that need to connect to something larger that Kant is speaking to. It's not about blind obedience, but about recognizing the inherent, dignity, the importance of moral action, even when it's tough.
Yeah, that resonates with me. And he doesn't shy away from the hard stuff either. That whole idea of radical evil coming from within us, from our own choices, that was pretty intense, but also kind of makes sense.
It's a challenging concept for sure, but it also speaks to this huge responsibility that comes with our freedom. We can choose good, but we can also choose evil. And Kant's urging us to choose wisely, to shape our own moral destinies.
Okay, I'm feeling the weight of that responsibility, but also I'm feeling inspired. Like, Kant's giving us a roadmap, not to just blindly follow, but to use our own reason to make our own choices.
That's a great way to put it. And we'll explore that roadmap in more detail in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll get into the specifics of how we can cultivate moral development, confront evil in ourselves and in the world, and create a more ethical and, meaningful life.
I'm ready when you are. This Kantian adventure is just getting started, but for now, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions.
And maybe start thinking about how you might orient yourself, how you might find your own guiding principles within this vast and fascinating landscape of thought.
We'll see you back here soon for part 2 of our exploration of Kant's philosophy of religion.
Until then, keep those brains buzzing and keep diving deep.
All right, welcome back to our Kantian deep dive. So before the break, we were talking about how Kant sees religion as a force for good, but he's also, a little suspicious of it.
Right. He's not afraid to call out those who use religion for their own selfish ends. He calls it priestcraft, basically, when religious authority gets twisted, used for power or control instead of genuine moral guidance.
So it's like he's saying be wary of anyone who's preaching one thing but living another.
Exactly. For Kant, walking the walk is more important than talking the talk. He even compares some religious practices to fetishism.
Yeah, fetishism. Okay, that's a strong word.
He means it in the sense of clinging to outward forms, rituals, and dogmas without really grasping their inner meaning or purpose.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about going through the motions, but really understanding why we're doing these things and making sure they're actually leading us toward moral improvement.
You got it. True religion for Kant isn't about performing rituals just because you're told to. It's about cultivating a virtuous disposition and acting in accordance with that moral law we were talking about.
Okay, that makes sense. But isn't there some value in ritual and tradition? Don't those things help us connect to something, something bigger than ourselves?
That's a great question, and it's something Kant grapples with, too. He sees that religious practices can have a social function, a psychological function, but he worries that they can also become substitutes for real moral effort.
So it's like taking a shortcut, thinking that just because you go to church or pray a certain number of times, you're automatically a good person.
That's one way to look at it. He wants you to dig deeper, examine your motivations, make sure you're acting out of genuine commitment to doing the right thing, not just trying to appease some external authority or fit in with social expectations.
Okay, so outward actions are important, but they shouldn't replace the inner work of actually trying to be a better person. And speaking of trying to be better, that brings us back to this idea of the ethical community.
Ah, yes, the kingdom of God on earth. It's Kant's vision of a society that's truly grounded in moral law and virtue.
But how do we actually get there? Does he give us a step-by-step guide on how to create this ethical community?
Well, he doesn't give us a blueprint, but he makes a key distinction between a juridical community and an ethical community.
Okay, I'm listening. What's the difference?
Think of a juridical community as one based on external laws. You follow the rules because you're afraid of punishment. An ethical community, on the other hand, is all about internal moral principles.
So one is about following the rules because you have to, and the other is about doing the right thing because you genuinely believe it's the right thing to do.
Precisely. And for Kant, that ethical community can exist even within a political community, but it operates on a totally different level. It's about cultivating a sense of shared moral responsibility, going beyond just the letter of the law.
But who decides what's morally right in this ethical community? Is it like a vote?
That's where Kant goes really deep. He says true morality can't be imposed from the outside. It has to come from within, from your own reason. He calls this inherent moral compass the moral law.
Okay, so it's like we're all born with an innate sense of right and wrong. I mean, that's a nice thought, but honestly, sometimes it feels like my moral compass is totally broken.
So you're hitting on a key problem. If this moral law is so universal, why do we struggle to follow it? Why do we do things we know are wrong?
Yeah. Like if I've got this perfect moral GPS built in, why do I keep taking the wrong exit?
Kant grappled with this too. He says it comes down to what he calls radical evil, this tendency we have to put our own selfish desires above the demands of that moral law.
Okay, radical evil sounds pretty serious. Is he saying we're all just inherently bad?
Not necessarily. It's more about acknowledging this constant tension within us between our rational moral side and those impulsive self-serving urges. It's a battle we all face.
So it's like an inner tug of war between our better angels and our, well, not so angelic impulses.
Exactly. And willpower alone isn't enough to win that tug of war. Kant says we need something more, something to ground our moral striving, to give us strength to resist those temptations.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the secret weapon against my inner demons?
Remember that concept of rational faith we talked about earlier? That's where it comes back into play. Kant argues we need to root our moral efforts in something bigger than ourselves. A belief in ultimate moral order, in a God who ensures that justice prevails, that striving for good is not in vain.
So it's like, if there's no ultimate accountability, no sense that our choices matter in the grand scheme of things, why even bother trying to be good?
That's the point. Rational faith provides the foundation for building a moral life. It gives us the strength to resist temptation, overcome selfishness, and work towards a life guided by those moral principles.
Wow, I'm seeing how all these ideas connect now. The moral law, rational faith, the ethical community, it's all part of a bigger picture of how we can become better human beings.
That's a fantastic insight. And it's this emphasis on interconnectedness, on the holistic nature of moral experience, that makes Kant's philosophy so powerful. He's not just giving you rules, he's giving you a way to orient yourself in the world, a way to understand your place in the universe and your responsibility to yourself and others.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But didn't Kant use some pretty, well, intense examples to get his point across? I remember reading about some pretty disturbing stuff.
Oh yeah, he doesn't shy away from the darker sides of human nature. He states some pretty shocking examples of cruelty from, as he calls them, savages.
Like what kind of examples?
He talks about ritualistic murders, senseless violence, things that seem to completely defy any sense of morality or reason, but he's not trying to pass judgment on specific cultures or groups.
So what's the point then?
He uses these extreme cases to show us that humans are capable of great darkness, even without civilization or external laws. It's a reminder that this potential for evil exists within all of us.
So it's not about some people being born evil, but about recognizing this universal capacity for both good and evil that we all have.
Exactly. And he uses equally strong language to describe how even in civilized societies, moral corruption can still take root. He talks about deceit in friendships, resentment towards those who help us. It's like he's saying that even with all the advantages of education and refinement, we're still vulnerable to those darker impulses.
So it's not about pretending we're perfect, but about recognizing our flaws and working to overcome them.
That's it. And this leads to another key point for Kant: freedom and moral responsibility. He says you're not just a puppet of fate or a slave to your passions. You have reason. You have the ability to make moral choices. That's what makes you human.
Okay, so I have freedom, but I'm also prone to this radical evil. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It's a challenge, for sure. But remember, Kant doesn't just say, try harder. He believes we need a fundamental shift in our disposition, a reorientation of our will towards goodness.
Whoa, a fundamental shift. That sounds like a pretty major renovation. How do I even start on that?
Well, this is where everything we've been discussing comes together. He says we need to root our moral striving in something beyond ourselves, something that gives our actions purpose and meaning, that transcends individual experience.
Are you talking about rational faith again?
Exactly. It's not about blind belief, but about using your reason to figure out what beliefs are necessary for living a moral life. It's about making those beliefs the foundation of your actions.
So it's my responsibility to figure out what I believe and then live according to those beliefs. That's a lot of pressure.
It is. But for Kant, it's the only way to live a truly moral life. He believed in the power of reason to guide us towards truth, to help us make sense of this complex world.
This is all really making me think. It's not just some abstract philosophy. It's like a guide to living a better life.
That's exactly what he intended. It's a way of engaging with those big questions, wrestling with those ideas of good and evil, and ultimately striving to become better.
Okay, I think I need a minute to process all of this. Can we take a quick pause and recap what we've covered?
Absolutely. It's good to take a breather when you're tackling Kant. What are some of the key takeaways for you so far?
Well, I'm really struck by how morality for Kant isn't about blindly following rules or just believing what you're told. It's about using your own reason to figure out what's right and then having the courage to actually live by those principles.
That's a great point. And that idea will keep coming up as we explore his thoughts on moral development and living a virtuous life in a world full of temptations.
I'm ready to keep going. But for now, we'll leave our listeners to ponder these ideas. What role does rational faith play in your life? How do you navigate those internal struggles between good and evil?
And remember, this philosophical journey is an ongoing one. There's always more to learn, more to discover, and more to question. Keep your minds engaged and keep diving deep.
All right, we're back. I gotta say, diving into Kant's philosophy is like a workout for your brain.
It is. He doesn't let you off easy, does he? Always pushing you to think deeper, examine your assumptions.
And take responsibility for your own moral development,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's not enough to just have good intentions. You actually have to, do something.
Exactly. He's calling for action. But it's not just any action. He wants those actions to be grounded in reason, in a conscious understanding of what's right and wrong.
That whole idea of the lawless use of reason really struck a chord with me. Like, you can't just pick and choose what you want to believe.
Right. It's not a buffet. You have to engage with the whole system, wrestle with the tough questions, and let your reason be your guide. And be willing to change your mind when you encounter new information or perspectives.
You know, it's funny. I thought Kant was going to be all about, like, cold, hard logic. But there's this surprising warmth to his philosophy.
I know what you mean. It's like he genuinely cares about human flourishing. He wants us to figure out how to live good lives, meaningful lives, lives that are, worthy of our dignity as rational beings.
I love that. It's not just some intellectual exercise. It's about actually becoming better people. But okay, there's one thing I'm still struggling with. If true religion is all about morality, about trying to be good, what does Kant have to say about the afterlife? The end of all things. What happens when we die?
Yes, the big existential questions. Don't worry, Kant doesn't shy away from those either. He dedicates a good chunk of his work to exploring those ideas.
So does he have, like, a definitive answer? Is there heaven and hell? Reincarnation, what's the deal?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. He doesn't claim to have all the answers. In fact, he's very upfront about the limits of human reason when it comes to these ultimate mysteries.
So he's comfortable saying, I don't know. Coming from a philosopher, that's pretty surprising.
It is, but it doesn't mean he just gives up. He uses his understanding of reason, morality, and the universe to offer some pretty thought-provoking possibilities.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued.
Yeah.
Give me a taste of what he says about eternity.
Well, he suggests that maybe the end of all things isn't a literal event like some dramatic doomsday scenario. Maybe it's more of an ongoing process, a culmination of our moral progress.
So it's not about some specific point in time, but about the journey itself.
Exactly. He even talks about time ceasing to exist. He quotes the book of Revelation, henceforth time shall be no more, to describe the state of eternity. It's like, imagine a reality where past, present, and future, those categories just dissolve.
Okay, now my brain is officially melting. Trying to picture that is like trying to imagine a new color.
I know, right? It pushes our comprehension to the limit, but that's what I love about Kant. He's not afraid to ask those really big, mind-bending questions.
But okay, with all this talk about eternity and the afterlife, doesn't that kind of undermine his emphasis on morality in this life?
Not at all. He's saying that even though we can't know for sure what happens after we die, we should act as if our choices and actions have eternal significance.
So it's not about earning brownie points for the afterlife. It's about living a virtuous life because it's the right thing to do, period.
Exactly. True morality, for Kant, isn't about some cosmic reward system. It's about aligning yourself with that moral law simply because it's your duty as a rational being.
That's so powerful. It takes the focus off of what's in it for me and puts it on like the inherent value of goodness itself.
And it also suggests that your actions have a ripple effect that contribute to the overall moral fabric of the universe, even if you can't see the full impact.
So even seemingly small acts of kindness or courage can make a difference. I love that.
It means your life has meaning, your choices have weight, regardless of what happens after you die. It all ties back into that idea of the kingdom of God.
Right. And it's not some distant paradise. It's something we're creating right now through our actions.
Precisely. It's both challenging and empowering. Challenging because it requires self-awareness, honesty about our flaws, and a commitment to choosing good. But empowering because it means we have the power to shape our own destinies to make the world a better place.
Wow. This has been an incredible journey. I feel like Kant has given me a whole new way of looking at, well, everything.
That's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It opens up new perspectives, new ways of understanding ourselves and the world around us. And with Kant, there's always more to discover, more layers to unpack.
Well, folks, we've climbed the Kantian mountain, explored the peaks and valleys of reason and faith. We hope you've enjoyed the view.
And as you continue your own explorations, remember Kant's advice. Orient yourself in thinking. Question everything, challenge your own beliefs, and use your reason to find your way.
And above all, act with courage and compassion, knowing that your choices matter. Until next time, keep those minds buzzing and keep diving deep.